I'm Joanna Kopaczyk, and I'll be hosting this session in my capacity as the academic officer of Oor Vyce. Oor Vyce is a civic campaign for the official recognition of the Scots language. So in short, you can say that we are trying to campaign and lobby for the Scots Language Act. And today's topic is finding Oor Vyce, finding your own voice and what it means to be a Scots speaker, but also what our organization is trying to do and trying to represent. The other part of our topic today is what's next. So what are our steps in the future and our aspirations? And I would like to encourage everybody to ask questions and comments, pop them in the chat wherever you're watching. If you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, please leave us some comments and some questions to the panelists, and we will get to them as we go. So with me today, I have a pleasure to introduce three people who are part of the Oor Vyce campaign. Two of them are with me on the committee, and one person is kind of representing the wider membership of the campaign. I've got Jack Capener here, so the person who started it all about a year ago. So Jack is a political activist. He's a language activist, and he's our political officer, and he's going to talk about his experience in a bit. I also have Andrew Maitalnd. Andrew is a civil servant in London, but he hails from Aberdeen, where he also studied politics and international relations. And Andrew is our treasurer. And last but not least, I've got the wonderful Ishbel Mcfarlane, who's a performer, who's an author. She also describes herself as a theatre maker, which is something I really love because it gives you the feeling of the actual creation and making things. Her play, U for Hulud, U is for Hulud, is a wonderful piece which engages with the question of language and identity and really focuses on Scots in Ishbel's own experience. And I saw that play a few years ago in Edinburgh, and it was fantastic. I was very inspired also because it was very interactional and invited audience and its audience's participation. Unfortunately, the play is not being performed at the moment, but I hope Ishbel has the book somewhere handy, because the play has now been published as a book. So Ishbel, if you can wave it in front of your face, yes, that's two Ishbels now on the screen, but you can get hold of the book, and I very much recommend it. So these are panelists for today, and what I would like to start with is that question of finding your voice. So how did you find your Scots voice? What does that mean for you? And then what has attracted you to Oor Vyce as the campaign that is advancing this notion of your own voice and what we can do with it in the future? Can I start with Jack, please? Jack, how did you find your Scots voice?
Oh, it's not making a lot of noise there. Hold on. Is that Jack is mute?
Can you hear me all right? I'm just checking you can actually hear my Scots voice.
We can hear.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it's absolutely it's proud to be here, and it's proud to be in this event for the awards. Certainly a good opportunity to get through some of the meaty themes that we need to be discussing as a community before we get to all the revelry. But in terms of my own Scots voice, how I kind of come across it, I'm from East Edinburgh myself, and although Edinburgh Scots is kind of definitely more neglected as a dialect that we talk about, it's still very much alive and kicking. And I was brought up with Scots all around me all the time. It's in the community, it's in the family, it's all around the place. But I, like a lot of folk, obviously, gone into education, gone through school, gone through university. I kind of suppressed it within myself, but it was actually when I lived abroad for the first time in Chile, living with folk from all different areas and parts of the world, that I started to re-explore my Scots and start re-examining it, because I would drop Scots words into my English. Folk would ask, what's that mean? I haven't heard that before. And I'd have to suddenly think, what is that I'm speaking? Because it isn't English, but what is it really? Because it wasn't a question I'd examined myself for that. And when I started speaking Scots, braider Scots to folk that weren't from Scotland, their reaction tended to be, oh, it's just like what Portuguese is to Spanish, or it's like what Dutch is to German. And that was like a mind-blowing moment for me, because that was like, this isn't some slang, this isn't some dialect, this is like one of the grand European language strains. And ever since then, I've just been more and more immersed in my Scots, using it more every day. And, you know, lang syne of the days that I thought it was something to repress.
Yeah, I think we've been hearing similar stories from many people throughout the day today. So something kind of clicking at some point and prompting you to engage more with your heritage and with your way of expressing yourself. Was that something similar for you, Ishbel?
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Bro. Well, I had an upbringing that was quite pro-Scots in my own home. And that's quite unusual, I suppose, for folk in terms of it was politically pro-Scots language. My mother and father were Scots language campaigners themselves, and so they were deliberate in their use of Scots with me. But the draw of school, other family, friends, in at nursery and playgroup and that, being told I was wrong, being told it wouldn't get me a job. You know, when I was 3 or 4 year old, should me use the word breeks instead of trousers, because can you get a job that way? It meant that I rejected it as often maybe a first or second generation immigrant would, but in my own country. And that's something I think a lot of minority and minoritized cultures have, whether they're at home or abroad. And so for me, Finn My Voice came doing the show in some ways, studying Scots. I'd done Scots poetry, the one, one of the few areas that we can hey Scots and be proud of it. In now, especially in January, the Scots Sacrosanct month. But I came through all that, and it still took me a long time to get my confidence back. And it was speaking, doing my show, writing it, coming to my own conclusions about my own experiences, using Scots all the time, and then going on tour with Michael Dempster, the Scots Screever, who was our education guy, and just talking with him. And it showed me the power of hearing other folk confidently use Scots to you, even in an environment with some folk using English. And it was that really gave me my voice back.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic to hear. Andrew, what was your journey towards Scots language?
So for me, I had sort of an interesting route where, like the other people on this panel, I was brought up with Scots language, quite sort of colloquial Northeast Scots that was being used on a regular basis by my mother and my, I guess, maternal grandparents, who are both from Aberdeen. And during my sort of early years, I didn't think anything of it at all. But it was a funny one. So when I got to secondary school, I would still be using like Scots terms, saying, "Oh, I didn't ken what that is," and saying stuff like that. But it was interesting. Unlike others, I wasn't told by teachers or other folk that I shouldn't be doing it. It was when I was saying to other folk in my year of school, speaking like that, I had them saying, "Oh, your accent's a bit too posh to be speaking like that." And it became this weird sort of class dimension where, like, if you were from a certain more affluent area of town, you were meant to speak in a very refined Queen's English way of speaking at all times. So after that, I guess, not knowing any better, I just developed speaking English as sort of natural thing as all time, and became sort of ignorant of the fact that I would be like, "Oh, he's speaking like these weird words that aren't proper English. That's bad." And it was only much later on, after I left university and sort of became more aware of linguistics and I guess just the information around like just being around people from so many different backgrounds. When I especially moved to London, I started thinking like, and started reading into more about the fact that Scots was its own entity. And as I learned more and more about it, I felt particularly passionate about trying to revive the position of Scots as a real living thing, which obviously it is, but I guess increase the level of recognition for it. Because if you speak to folk down here, Maitalnd didn't ken that Scots is even a language. I was recently telling my colleagues from work about it, and they were asking if I spoke Gaelic. So it's just about, for me, it became sort of a passionate thing of emphasizing the reality that Scots is a living language and trying to just get it recognized for that.
Yeah, I think your story reminds me a little bit of my own when you're trying to talk to people abroad about the linguistic situation in Scotland. It's always not easy to start with because everybody thinks, oh, people in Scotland speak English with a funny accent, and that's it. But there is so much more complexity to it, isn't there? So these are really interesting stories, and your personal experience is obviously something that brings you to the question and the kind of engagement with the Scots also in a professional sense, in a way. But you also have chosen to become part of this campaign, which we have called Oor Vyce. So what was the attraction? Why did you decide? Why did you choose to get more involved? And perhaps we should start with Jack again, because it's all started with your initiative. So Jack, can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with the idea?
All right, so Oor Vyce was essentially, I mean, through my, like you say, Joanna, the personal stories of who we get involved in Scots very much are interlinked with work activism on Scots. And in my own case, it was a case I got really interested in, reclaiming my Scots Vyce, and then come back to Scotland, spoke Scots like I would speak English anywhere else, and found that it was hard. It was really difficult to be speaking Scots every day. You got judged, you got looked down upon, and I can certainly really sympathise with Andrew's point about the Scots accents. A lot of Scots Vices aren't what you'd say as a Scots accent, and I certainly feel with my own, it's no the kind of accent that a lot of folk would associate with the Scots language. So I found it really, really hard to be speaking Scots, and that kind of struggle pushed me towards kind of seeking activism to change that situation a bit. And obviously, when you're taking part in activism on any subject, you start by looking, what is the government doing the new? And well, slating them our badly, I looked at it, and there was very little that I could see was being done for Scots. Especially proportional to the number of speakers. Again, it's 30% of the population, 1.5 million folk, and the funding is little more than 400,000 a year. There's very little fully paid posts in Scots, so I was looking into this and just got more and more frustrated at the lack of action being taken. So I thought, who do we push for action? We get all the community together, round the table, and speak with Oor Vyce as a community. So it isn't just one group or another dialect or another dialect. It's all day in the community speaking together with Oor Vyce. So Oor Vyce is a very deliberate attempt to get all the community round the table to discuss what we think, what we want, and what we're aiming for. Scots speakers for all airts, and communicate that to policymakers. And so it's a kind of lobbying group. It's a pressure group, and it's a platform for us to communicate with policymakers and the Scottish Government and Parliament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, certainly something that I found attractive about the movement was its inclusivity. Not being a speaker of Scots myself, although perhaps I am trying to find my own Scots voice, and maybe I will succeed at some point. But I certainly felt that there was a space for me in this movement as well, and it's very open, it's very inclusive, it's for everybody who is just passionate about the cause. So Andrew, if I can now invite you to maybe comment on why you ended up on our committee.
Sure. So for me, I think with any sort of language which ends up being a bit neglected, I guess, in a sort of formal sense, there does have to be a body of people who are willing to take it forward and establish the sort of political recognition of the language to get it up and running again. If you look at a lot of countries in the former Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe, the sort of movements that you had to get to re-establish languages in the 19th century is the same sort of position where there's no political recognition of a living language that people use, but isn't properly used in schools, it isn't properly legislated for. And in a lot of ways, Scots has a lot of catching up to do in that ways, because although there's obviously been a lot of work that's gone into it and development, I think, like Jack says, the amount of political endeavors to try and put it up there are just insufficient at the moment. And the main thing for me is that I think the groundwork that Oor Vyce is trying to do at the moment is really like the first key step to developing that. And what I would love is to have Scots being taught on an equal footing to English, and where in parts of the country where it's spoken Gaelic, and at the same time also be a language that's applicable to other folk fae, other countries to be able to speak. I've often told my own girlfriend, who's from Hungary, that if she's wanting to look for an easy second language to learn as well as English, she might as well go for Scots as well. So it'd be great to be able to be in a position where there's the outlet and resources to be able to properly do that.
Yeah. Ishbel, how about you? Why are you with us? Why are you part of Oor Vyce?
Well, I think that sort of cross-organisation or feeling that Jack was talking about there is definitely pairt. And I think in doing my research for my show and in experience of studying Scottish ethnology and stuff at the university, realising, much like Andrew was saying, that the similarities between Scots and other languages in other places. I think we can come to this conclusion in Scotland that we're somehow a weird outsider for having minority languages at all, because we look at our neighbour down in England and that sees itself, it isn't obviously, but it sees itself as a monoglot country. And so looking at what other countries do to he's up their own leids, to he's up the speakers and users and signers, their own leids, and seeing what works there, what does it do, and who does it do it. And I think that here Scots lead act, or the different outcomes that Oor Vyce is sort of fighting for, is always to get towards that confidence that you can't make speakers here confidence for the outside, but you can lay the groundwork that allows them to grow in that way. And in things like the Scots Language Awards, I just feel the difference. It's the second year and I already feel that difference of folk, that kind of excitement or a culture that has excellence in it. And all that, I think, is some stuff that you can make happen in folks' hearts by doing something for the outside.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's so much enthusiasm and so much people do within their fields, and the creativity that's behind it. It's amazing. So in a way, if I could play a devil's advocate for a bit here, one could say Scots is experiencing this fantastic revival, and people are no longer thinking twice if they want to use it on social media and elsewhere, and we've got the language awards and so on. So in a way, there is no reason it can't develop and flourish in the future, regardless of whether there is a Scots Language Act or not. So why is it important at all? I mean, maybe let's just get on with things and use Scots, and that's it, and that's enough. What's your reaction to that, Ishbel?
I think I can definitely understand that reaction, and I mind another Scots language campaigner talking about the fact that sort of badges, you know, your wee badge that says "we hae a insert language here act" does nothing at all. However, a lot of this success that Scots has had, or the slán doon or any kind of degradation of Scots, has come out of legislation. Just no a Scots Language Act as yet. The EU legislation on minority leids has been absolutely vital to the support of Scots language, Gaelic language, British Sign Language here in Scotland. And it's though we didn't have a Scots Language Act specifically yet, legislation has been important. And a Scots Language Act would allow organisations to bring the language as far to the forefront of cultural decisions, planning decisions, building decisions, all the things as it needs to be for, as Jack says, the speakers being a third of the population and folk really valuing it enough to say in the census that they're speakers and users and writers and readers. And I think that an act is something that you need for that, so that governments can come and go and the language can keep its strength.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, Ishbel. Is this how you see things developing, Jack, in that context as well? Is this why we need the Scots Language Act?
I would actually be inclined to agree with your devil's advocate there. That I think Scots is a thrawn wee bismel leid. It's clung on against all the odds for hundreds of years. And I think it'll had clinging on for a long, long while with any more support. But I think, and I think that's largely because of the individuals and the volunteers that are putting their life's work into holding up the leid and protecting it, teaching it in the school. You know, folk are using their own time, their own energy, and their own siller to keep Scots alive, and it's working. Scots is alive, but I think that misses the point. I think we shouldn't settle for folk, individuals, private persons using their own time and siller to save Scots. I think there's only so much that you can do as an individual. You can't put in place a national strategy with all the other individuals that are putting in the effort. You can't put in place proper funding, you know. So you need, at some point, legislation to then boost what these individuals are already doing. We are relying as a community on these individuals, on volunteers, on activists. Legislation wouldn't come in and take all that over and ding them out and do it itself. It would support them to do it better. That's what's really essential about a Scots Language Act. It would put in place the groundwork to support what's already being done at the moment and make sure that it's done better. So I think absolutely, you know, the leid's going to survive, but if it's going to thrive, we need to really ease up what's actually being done now. And that's what we need legislation for.
Yeah, and I think it would also be a shame not to pick up on some of the work that has already been done to bring this point home, right? So all the work that was present in the Scottish Parliament, for example, done by the cross-party group on Scots some years ago. So there is definitely something to build on. Andrew, is this again something you would see as you know, a question of language just doing its own thing and the users and the speakers getting on with things, or do you feel legislation would change something also from a perspective of, let's say, someone living down south? Do you think that would have an impact?
I think it's very important for at least, you know, 2 reasons. For me, I'd say that from the first thing, as pointed out before, was that I think if you have more money to do more things with, then it makes a huge difference, to be honest. If you're in a position where you have the money to do more initiatives on a sort of grassroots level, or even just get people to independently do things like that, then it makes a huge difference to being able to support the sort of organizations that are independently doing things at the moment. And I think also the value of legislation is about the value of recognition, because I think it's way too easy to just be in a position where you're saying, oh, it's just slang. And that is the ultimate curse word in some ways, that it's easy to deride a language if you don't give it any sort of recognition in a formal sense. And people can be discriminated against or mocked or whatever just because that there's no formal recognition. And although that's kind of for example, on an EU level or on a Scots government level, there'll be some document that says Scots is recognised an official lead. The main issue is that this isn't something that's widely spoken about on a lot, like at a sort of day-to-day level. People didn't ken that they're speaking a lead, which is incredible. You can't imagine going over to Greece or Spain and saying, oh, do you realize that you're speaking your own language? So I think about the value of recognition is really important, because if people can recognize what they're doing themselves, then they can carry on what they're doing. And I think that strengthens their resolve to do what they're doing.
Yeah, that's actually very well put, giving the Scottish voice validation, recognition, legitimacy. So in a way, that brings me to another question that is very often raised among Scots activists, is that the question of language shouldn't be politicized, because it's for everybody. Everybody has their own voice, as we keep saying today. So where is the politics in all this? You know, you mentioned resources, you mentioned political action. Is this something that you see as potentially divisive? Can Scots be politicized or made into a kind of political movement without being divisive? How would you react to those notorious and quite difficult, challenging issues, Jack?
Scots absolutely shouldn't be politicised. You're spot on with that. And I think it isn't being. I think there is, if you spend all your time on social media and engage with the Scots world on social media, you're going to see accusations that it's a plot by this party or this constitutional position. It will inevitably be tied to politics. But I think that kind of politicisation of Scots, that evaporates when it comes into contact with sunlight, because the reality is Scots isn't a political issue. It isn't a party political issue. It isn't a constitutional issue. I mean, it's an issue of linguistic rights. We're asking for mere rights as speakers to use the way we speak. Linguistic rights are human rights, and human rights absolutely should not be tied to one political view or another. And I think that's something that the political kind of establishment and the political sphere in Scotland at the moment gets. It understands. It certainly understood it in the context of Gaelic, because the Gaelic Language Act in 2005 was voted unanimously through. There wasn't a single MSP that voted against it. There is kind of this broad recognition that Scots is not anything to do with politics. It's a rights issue, and it shouldn't be tied to any party or constitutional position. And you know, the main accusation you tend to get on Twitter and the like is that it is an SNP nationalist ploy to make us more different to the English. But so many Scots speakers vote Conservative or voted no in the referendum. So that view really just doesn't align with reality. You know, places like the Northeast are, you know, that there's some real Conservative and no voting strongholds there, and that's where the Doric really thrives. So if you actually went and tell these folk that, you know, the way you speak is just a nationalist ploy, they go, what? Or fit? It just doesn't align with the reality. So, you know, we need to keep making the argument that it's linguistic rights, human rights, and that, you know, Obdi agrees something should be done, regardless of politics.
I think that's very well put. Linguistic rights. This is what we're here for, aren't we, Ishbel?
I mean, in some ways, I agree with absolutely everything Jack said. But I would say it's, in terms of, I suppose it depends how you define politicised. I'd say all language use, all leid is politics, and that they're absolutely wrapped up. The idea that English language is no political is a complete fantasy. You know, ask MD in the Caribbean whether the fact that English is used there has any political meaning, and that's all language use is political, and so I think it's no pairt political. And the very slightly euphemistic constitutional issues, I think that it isn't aligned directly in those ways. And some leids, they do that. Like I ken that Catalan is quite closely aligned linguistically and then a political movement. But Scots leid doesn't have to be like that. It isn't like that. And I think that there are politics in every decision that you make, in the same way that feminism used to say the personal is political. I think that that's the same with Scots. It's a political act to use Scots when you go into the doctor. It's a political act to use it in a courtroom. It's a political act to apply for a job in it. It doesn't mean that it shows that you voted X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take on it, Ishbel. I think it's an identity question as well, isn't it? And the way you prefer to present yourself to the world, and that's, in a way, it's a defining act in itself, the way you choose to present yourself to the world. Andrew, what's your take on it? Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, my views are very similar to the other two. So I think it is, you can't necessarily treat it as a political element any more than other aspects of culture. I think if you were to say something in the Parliament like, we should be trying to promote Scots literature, not even Scottish language, but in terms of just like literature from Scotland. But everyone, any MP, pretty much everyone would agree with that. There'd be no issue. Everyone would just say, oh, that's fine, because everyone values the nature of culture. And this is just another element of wider Scottish culture. I mean, we're not really looking at, it's not even just about the teaching, it's about the promotion of Scots as an entity within wider society. It's something that exists already. It's not something that's being created out of a vacuum. We're just trying to promote something that exists and make sure that it's given the legs to stand on, really, that it deserves. And I think, as Ishbel said as well, that all language is politicized to an extent, even where it's a very establishment element. I mean, let's remember at the same time, English was entirely a political entity within Scotland, in the way that from the 18th century onwards, it was pushed as a way of repressing any sort of entity of Scotland or Scots identity. So it's all language is political in some element. It's just about not turning into a football and just respecting it for what it is.
Yeah, I think the way you talk about the 18th century perceptions really resonates with me, because looking at Scots from a historical perspective, obviously this is such a big part of your heritage and your nation's story, isn't it? So really not paying enough attention to that aspect is also devoiding yourself from bits of culture and that connection with the past, which we shouldn't neglect. But I also wanted to maybe press a little bit on some even harder issues, because obviously here, and you know, we've been having a wonderful day and we are looking forward to the gala in the evening, but I think this particular panel is really well placed to address some challenging issues, you know, head on. And one of them for me especially is, you know, as we're sitting here talking, we probably represent a narrow margin of people who are involved in Scots in some way, because, you know, we are within a certain age bracket, and probably we are middle class, and probably, you know, we have these similar educational experiences and things like that. So do you see that as problematic, that between us, a largely kind of central belt, middle class, relatively young people are talking about these things? Is this an issue? Is this something that you would see as problematic? What's your answer to that? And is this something that Oor Vyce is trying to represent, or are we looking broader? Are we seeing more? Andrew, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. So for me, I'd say that the very nature of this organization is about trying to overcome that in a lot of ways, because again, it is an issue of education being a limiting factor. I mean, the only reason I was able to learn about Scots as an entity is because of just reading through Wikipedia pages and stuff like that. I mean, it's not everyone's idea of a good social life, but I think that's not something that's necessarily applicable that everyone has access to in the same way. So I think this organization and movement is very important in the fact that we're trying to give Abdi a voice to participate in this. And I think that is definitely one of the key elements that should be focused upon, because I think it's the people who don't necessarily understand that it's Scots as its own lead are going to be the ones who suffer the most from discrimination and being told that, oh, you're not speaking English right. So I think it's the most important thing we can do is to try and get a wide cross section and just work in general to try and increase awareness of Scots as an entity, so that everyone, regardless of what part of society, if they can have a voice in participating in it.
It's about normalization, isn't it? Would you agree with that, Jack?
Aye, yeah, definitely. I think Andrew's hit on a really important point that, you know, we, in a certain sense, are privileged to be able to, you know, recognize Scots in this way and discuss Scots in this way, because we come to a place where, you know, it's maybe less of a politicized act. Maybe it's easier for us to speak Scots. It's easier for us to discuss Scots, and we care about it. We come to a place of privilege, and like all people in places of privilege, you then have an onus to kind of use that privilege for good and try and affect change with it. And that's exactly what Oor Vyce is trying to do. You know, if we represent a small margin of the Scots community, then we need to be doing all in our power to widen that margin and really bring folk on board. And I think that's something we're definitely trying hard to do, and it's definitely something that we try and be guided by our members. We try to be, you know, an organisation that is led. Oh, is everything? Oh, sorry, I thought I'd frozen there. We try and be an organisation that's led by the membership and, you know, open, transparent, and brings everybody on board. Oor Vyce is about Oor Vyce as a community. It's not about Oor Vyce as middle class central belters. It's about all Scots speakers, and that's what we want to do. And we can only do that if we reach out to folk and encourage them to get on board. So I'll use this wee platform as just a plea. If you want Oor Vyce to be part of Oor Vyce, then get on board, because we want you. We want you to be feeding into the process. We want to fully represent what Scots is and who Scots speakers are. We want to be as much Doric as we are Shetland, as we are Central Belt, or as we are Borders. We want to be as much urban as we are rural, because that's who we can best communicate and make our case to policymakers. They will listen to us if we can demonstrate that we are the voice of the community. And we need all the viewers here today to feed into our processes, to be able to demonstrate that and really get things done.
Yes, that's very powerful, Jack, but absolutely we are all subscribed to that. And I would like to encourage everybody who's listening and watching to use the chat to ask any questions or post any comments. I know that some people have already done so. So we will stop in a second, maybe to have a look at the chat and what's going on there. But before that, I would just like to give the floor to Ishbel again on the same issue, on the same topic: representation, validation, normalization. Ishbel.
I mean, it's a big one. And the kind of group that you're describing us as is that the domination of that group that I'm in. all kinds of activism is something that is in right enough has come right to the front of discussions, whether that's climate activism, whether it's language activism, whether it's feminism, and I really see linguistic rights, Oor Vyce, as part of a large and global community of different kinds of activism that is often led by people that are at the most marginalised. And so we're no making activism out of hail cloth here. We're using the skills, we're getting up on the shoulders of Black, Indigenous, people of colour, refugees, asylum seekers, folk that have been campaigning for years, and we're using the tools that they're teaching us. And so it is really in our interest to learn. It's also in our interest to make sure that folk who are been at the university, and folk who, as Andrew says, maybe didn't even ken that the language that they're using is a language and isn't. So, I mean, how can my husband is from England and he studied linguistics, and I find it really bizarre to think that folk could be told that the language they spoke, that they didn't speak a language. Like, how could that be? And that is the way. So it's really at our responsibility to make sure that folk feel that connection, to actively go out in the way that the likes of Matthew Fitt and James Robertson has been doing for years, getting into schools, telling kids and saying, this is yours as much as it's mine. In fact, often more so.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Actually, Matthew and James were in a recording presented earlier today during the break, and I listened to their banter and their blather about the books that they've published and translated into Scots. And yeah, it's such a big part of how kids are growing up these days. And then obviously the Scots Language Award in schools. So there is so much good happening out there. That I think it would only be complemented, and it's a kind of natural process and natural step forward, the stuff that we are trying to achieve here. So I will now have a quick look at the comments and questions. So people have been saying Ishbel's O is for Hullet is fantastic. Laura Green says she loved it. And Susie Briggs is saying it's great to see people pushing forward with their passion for Scots. Stephen Mark Browning was saying he's been speaking Glasgow Scots, and he's been told it's died out or it's dying out, and he's there as a speaker, so it's one of these things that you hear people think about what you are, but that doesn't quite click. And then there is a few comments from Susie again about the prejudice her daughter was facing in school. So I mean, even 5 years ago, it looks like these attitudes have still been propagated, and it's not it's just not right, as we were saying earlier. We've got some more input from Alexandra Innes, who was just told by the teacher she wasn't pronouncing her banana quite correctly. So it's like, these wee things that you can get criticized for. There's my aunt finding it very interesting. Yes, I I made a point of letting folk know that we are doing these things, and people get quite excited about that. We've got some inputs from Jamie Fairbairn. Jamie's a fantastic teacher using Scots in his class in the Banff Academy. I believe he's up for an award this evening. So Jamie is saying, yes, we need the Act to promote and emphasize and empower the students, and emphasize everything that's been happening in schools. So generally, just really positive comments here. Yes, Laura Green finds it interesting that it's a political act to speak Scots in formal situations, which is something that you've brought up, Ishbel. And some people think it's a political issue because the generations have been denied the voice that they should have had. So that's something we should still be engaging with. And yeah, people just like the points about normalizing the leid. Yes, I'm just scrolling down because that's much along similar lines. So I can't really see questions as such. It's just people really responding to what you've been saying in a very positive way. So I'm really pleased that we have raised these questions and we have raised these sometimes slightly challenging issues, and also tried and put forward our own ways of addressing those challenges and those issues. So by way of wrapping up, I think I've got two more things to ask you, and in a more practical sense, and perhaps coming back to a question that Andrew Scott has just asked. So when do you think we'll get an act? So that actually links to my final, or one, maybe last but one question, which is, when we get the Scots Language Act, and feel free to speculate when that would be, what would change on day one? So the Scots Language Act is there. What's going to change, and when is that going to happen? Andrew, I'll start with you.
So in terms of timeline, it's still, I'd imagine, several years away, given the slow way that the policy machine works in all different countries. But what I would like to see come out of it, especially as a sort of first entity, I think for me, it would be about having some perhaps more formalized leadership platform to be able to take the language forward. So if there was at some point a proper board that got established, I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think if something like that was established, it would be very valuable for giving a sort of direction and steer towards the way that the language can be developed in a sort of formalized way and manner. And I think if that was something that was to come out of the Act, then that would be a very good step towards, again, recognition and about making sure that all the good work that's being done already can be sufficiently supported and organised in a way that's progressive for the future of Scots.
Thanks. Yes. Well, let's see. Ishbel, what do you think?
I don't know. Yeah, timelines. I mean, looking at, for example, I mean, we're not starting, like, as I say, from scratch, even in Scots language. There's been campaigning, you know, my parents were campaigning in the 70s, folk were campaigning in the 20s, you know, there's a ground there. But looking at the likes of the British Sign Language Act, you know, and they had a really 10, 15-year process. I'd love for it to be faster than that. The government's done it before. We can get the wheels going. But as for what I see in the changes, and I think a board does have, as Andrew says, its disadvantages and its advantages, but just having that visibility, having a visibility that means that the likes of, as Jamie Fairbairn was saying there, that schools, for example, are allowed to use Scots, encouraged to use Scots training in the curriculum for excellence, but there's sic a lang tail. It's no, you know, it's no muckle older than me that you were physically beaten at school for using Scots. Yeah. That's teachers that are miles off retirement yet, and they're teaching young teachers coming in the new. You know, it's a slow thing. So I want to sort of light that fire to speed that process up, to give folk the confidence that. I mind when I was at the university and we did Scots language poetry, and we were all Scots people in that classroom, and nobody could read that out in Scots in that classroom because we were at the university, and folk would read poems about Scots language, about the suppression of Scots that were in Scots, and would translate it into English. And because they couldn't get the words in Scots out of your mouth. And that's what I want. I want folk to feel you didn't have to get it right, but it's yours, and here, play with it. It's, you know, it's fine. Make mistakes. You didn't have to be perfect.
Yeah. So I mean, this really brings back the point made earlier today in discussion of the Doric, how important that was for one of the participants to do his professorial lecture in Scots, but it also felt like it was a statement. It was something unusual to do, and why should it be unusual? You know, that's always something that puzzles me as someone who comes to this situation from the outside. And it's your language. It's the language of your country, and so many people here, you know, have a background that shouldn't be denied. So that's something that I definitely see as, you know, there is a lot of work to be done here to legitimize it and normalize it. So Jack, when and what happens on day one?
I would say in terms of the timeline and the time frame we're working towards, it unfortunately is quite technical. I mean, that there is only so much legislation that the Parliament can get through in one term, and especially in the age of COVID, there's a lot that's just had to be kind of dinged out into the land grass, because it just isn't possible to get rid of it. But you know, the perfect timeline ahead would be one where all the main parties go into the Holyrood elections with commitments to Scots in their manifestos, all get together, round the table after the election, and thrash out a plan with a constant, you know, consultation with us, with the community. And if that were to happen, we'd be talking, you know, 3, 5, 7 kind of years. That's fingers crossed. We just didn't can at this point. But in terms of what it would do, I mean, it would certainly lay the groundwork for a lot of real kind of narrow, tangible policy outcomes. So it would lay the groundwork for more Scots broadcasting, more funding for existing groups that exist, you know, folk that are doing an amazing job for promoting the leid at the moment. If it's, you know, whether it's the poetry library, the Doric board, all these groups that are already there, it would lay the groundwork for more funding for them, improving them further. It would lay the groundwork for a national strategy, for a board. There's a lot of really kind of narrow policy objectives that it could lay the foundations for. But it's on day one, it's only laying the foundations for them. On day one, the main impact it has is exactly what Obdi's been saying here. It's normalization and destigmatization, because at the moment, you know, you can resist discrimination against Scots as much as you're wanting to, but when you hate the government taking action on it, suddenly that sends a message that it is a priority, that the government takes it seriously, that the government recognises A, there's an issue, and B, it's an issue big enough to take action on. So that totally changes the game for ordinary Scots speakers who, if they're faced with discrimination, if they're faced with stigmatisation, can then say, actually, nah, I deserve to be speaking this way. This is right to be speaking this way, and the government agrees with me. That's a real kind of psychological key shift for a lot of folk, and it's totally that kind of normalization where in 10 years it shouldn't be a massive statement to be speaking Scots. It should just be you're in Scotland, Scots is here. It's still bonny, it's still amazing, it's still, you know, a beautiful thing, but it isn't weird. It's just we're in Scotland, we speak Scots. Some of us stay, some of us didn't. Some of us speak Scots with an English accent, some of us speak Scots with a Polish accent. You know, it should just be a totally normalised, accepted thing in our society, because it's there, it isn't going anywhere. So let's accept it, let's normalise it, let's bring it into our conception of ourselves as a people.
I love the sound of it, and I can assure you there are already some Polish immigrants here speaking Scots with a Polish accent. You know, I had builders around my place at some point, and some of them were Polish, some of them were Scottish. And in order to communicate, you just have to pick up the real language, you know, the real language of the people. It's your English you picked up at school won't get you anywhere. So I think there should be space, and there is space, I think, for new speakers. But there are obviously various challenges around that as well. But thank you so much. Thank you for that. Thank you for your thoughts. Just to bring in maybe one final point that Jamie Fairbairn has made here in the chat. Another thing that the Scots Language Act would enable people to do is the school inspectors in the future to ask why certain schools are not engaging with Scots. So right now it's a choice, but maybe it would be an expectation in the future. So, there is a lot to be done. There is a lot of scope for further work, be it in education, be it in broadcasting, certainly in the legal and political sphere. I know that this panel has touched upon several issues that are sometimes glossed over because they are slightly uncomfortable, but I'm really pleased that you were happy to talk about these things, and I think we have benefited hugely from your insights. And personally, I always learn a lot from these encounters with people who are so immersed and just personally involved in everything. And as an academic who has an interest, a professional interest in Scots and its history, I find it most inspiring and illuminating. So thank you so much for this, and I hope our audience has enjoyed it as well today. So I think we will just bring it to a close. I would like to thank again Ishbel Mcfarlane, Jack Capener, and Andrew Maitalnd for joining me for this blether on finding Oor Vyce and whit, and now we know. So that was great, and thank you very much, guys.